Have you ever witnessed a moment that tore your faith in humanity, only to have it restored by a glimmer of truth? Today's story begins with an encounter on a quiet street, an encounter that escalates into a dramatic scene of accusation and injustice, forever altering the lives of two people on opposite sides of the law. In this emotionally charged tale, an innocent black man finds himself thrust into a devastating confrontation with a police officer. But just when despair seems certain, a hidden camera captures what really happened. The shocking revelations will leave you speechless, and the karmic consequences will give you hope. On an early spring morning in Chicago, the sun's rays filtered through the remnants of a late winter chill. The neighborhood was waking up. Delivery trucks rattled along the streets. Shop owners rolled up their metal shutters, and school buses streamed in neat lines. The air had that peculiar crispness that promised new beginnings, but also carried the echoes of winter's hardships. In a modest part of the city on West 63rd Street, known to locals simply as 63rd, a sleepy block was about to become the stage for a clash that would resonate far beyond its cracked sidewalk. Darius Washington was strolling back from a local diner where he had treated himself to an early breakfast of eggs and bacon. At 32 years old, Darius stood just over 6 feet tall, carried a dignified composure that demanded respect, and was a devoted older brother to two siblings who looked to him for guidance. Darius had spent his childhood in rough parts of Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Despite the constant pressure and adversity, he remained resilient. His heart was kind, his mind insightful, and his ambition unwavering. That day, Darius had woken up with plans to finalize paperwork for an upcoming job interview at a logistics company, one that felt like it could finally be the career change he deserved. He intended to drop by the library to print out some documents and then head to the interview site for a preliminary chat with the company's HR. It was a future he had been carefully envisioning, a stable role, a solid paycheck, and the promise of moving his younger siblings into a better environment. As he rounded the corner of 63rd and Pulaski, he passed by a small grocery store where he could see families picking up fresh produce. He smiled at the sight of a grandmother guiding her curious granddaughter through the aisles. Life felt peaceful in that moment, the type of peace that makes you momentarily forget that the world is not always kind. Then came the sound of screeching tires. A police cruiser with its blue and red lights swirling sped into view. Darius glanced over, curiosity piqued. It was unusual to see such urgency in a neighborhood that had been relatively calm for the past few weeks. The squad car halted abruptly at the curb near where Darius stood. The door flung open and out stepped Officer Colton Hayes. Officer Hayes was a man in his late 40s, with a tall and imposing frame that had once helped him excel in the police academy's physical tests. Over the years, the rigors of the job had hardened him. A perpetual scowl had found its way onto his face, becoming almost as permanent as the creases that lined his forehead. He had moved to the Chicago Police Department after years in a smaller precinct outside Gary, Indiana, hoping for more action and promotions. In the months since his transfer, Officer Hayes had indeed seen plenty of action, but not always for the right reasons. As soon as Officer Hayes stepped out of his cruiser, his eyes locked onto Darius with intense suspicion. Quickly, he approached, hand hovering near his holster. "Hey, you!" the officer barked. "Stop right there." The command was abrasive, echoing off the storefront windows. Pedestrians and drivers slowed to watch, drawn by the sudden hostility. Darius paused, a twinge of anxiety flickering in his chest. He was used to hearing cautionary tales from friends and neighbors, how a normal day could spiral into chaos if you looked a certain way in the wrong part of town. But he'd done nothing wrong. He had no reason to run, so he complied. "Yes, officer?" he asked, trying to keep his tone steady and non-confrontational. His eyes scanned the face of the man before him, searching for any sign of reason or empathy. Officer Hayes wasted no time. "We've had a report of vandalism and theft in this area," he said sharply. "You match the description we were given." His voice was laced with barely concealed aggression. Darius lifted his hands slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I just finished breakfast down the street. I haven't vandalized anything, and I don't know anything about theft." The tension in the air was palpable, thick as the humidity that sometimes blanketed the city in summer. Onlookers began to gather. Some stood on nearby porches, while others peered out from behind parked cars. The situation was dishearteningly familiar. A black man confronted by police, forced to prove his innocence before he'd even been properly questioned. To the growing crowd's horror, Officer Hayes stepped forward and snapped a pair of handcuffs around Darius's wrists. The metal bit into Darius's skin, sending a jolt of alarm through his system. The officer's voice was clipped. "All business. You're under arrest. We'll sort out the details at the station." Darius's eyes widened. "Arrest? On what grounds?" he protested, struggling to remain calm. "I haven't done anything illegal." But Officer Hayes tightened the cuffs and shoved him toward the squad car. Anger and fear surged within Darius, but he fought to control his emotions. He knew from stories and experience how quickly any sign of resistance could escalate. Some in the growing throng cried out in protest. Others whipped out their smartphones, capturing videos. One brave older woman, a staple of the neighborhood known as Miss Janine, interjected, "Officer, this young man has been living here all his life. He just came from the diner across the street. This is some kind of mistake." Hayes ignored her, guiding Darius roughly into the back seat. "I have a report that a man in a green hoodie and jeans matching his description smashed a car window just a few blocks away," the officer announced. "That's enough reason to bring him in for questioning." Darius was wearing a dark grey jacket and black pants, but any contradictions didn't seem to matter at this point. As the cruiser sped off, the spectators remained stunned. Several people shook their heads in dismay. A few approached Miss Janine to share her outrage. Others quickly posted their videos and remarks online, determined to spread the word about what they deemed an unjust arrest. Inside the cramped back seat, Darius stared out the window in disbelief. His mind raced, replaying the last few minutes as if trying to decode what had gone wrong. "Why me?" he thought. "I was just walking home." He couldn't quell the sinking feeling in his stomach, the sense that he'd been singled out. The officer had hardly provided any details beyond vague accusations that Darius fit the description. It made Darius wonder how often such accusations were thrown around without evidence. Officer Hayes, for his part, was tense and silent at the wheel. He was convinced that his hunch was right. In the past, ignoring his instincts had, in his eyes, cost him promotions. He had learned early in his career that it was better to act decisively than to appear weak or indecisive. Now, as the cruiser wove through traffic, his stern gaze was fixed on the road. The intensity rolling off him made it clear that he was determined to get a confession or some sort of statement from Darius, truth be damned. At the station, Darius was quickly brought to a small interrogation room. Pale, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating battered walls that told stories of countless interrogations. Officer Hayes made him sit down, uncuffed him, and stood over him like a looming tower. Another officer briefly stepped in to take notes, but quickly left, presumably to attend to other tasks. "All right," Hayes began, resting both hands on the metal table in front of Darius. "Tell me where you were this morning." Darius exhaled slowly, trying to keep his voice level. "I already told you. I went to the Regal Diner on 63rd for breakfast. I had eggs, bacon, and orange juice. I can give you the receipt. It's still in my pocket if you'll let me reach for it." He glanced anxiously at the officer, worried that any sudden movement might be misinterpreted as aggression. Hayes studied him for a moment, eyes narrowed. "Go ahead, slowly." Darius carefully pulled out the folded piece of paper from his jacket. Hayes snatched it, reading the timestamp that showed Darius had paid for his meal around 8:15 a.m. The reported vandalism call had come in at 8:20 a.m. from a location at least a mile away from the diner. "If you left the diner, you'd have had enough time to smash a car window," Hayes insisted, his tone accusatory. "We got a partial description. Tall, African-American male, dark clothing. That's you." Darius felt anger flare inside him. "Do you realize how many people that description could apply to? The only thing you said that's different is the color of my jacket. I never even saw a smashed car window. If you don't believe me, you can talk to the diner staff. They know me." Officer Hayes glared, seemingly torn between pursuing the arrest further and acknowledging that the evidence didn't align perfectly. Instead of verifying Darius's story right away, the officer leaned forward, eyes blazing. "Don't get smart with me. People around here will say anything to cover for each other." Then he scoffed, "We'll see who's telling the truth when the complaint files come in." The tension in the room was suffocating. On the one hand, Darius was desperate to get an ally, someone in the station to listen, check the facts, and confirm his innocence. On the other hand, Hayes seemed determined to make the charge stick. Left alone after the brief interrogation, Darius's thoughts spun. He worried not just for himself, but for his family. How would his siblings react to the news? Would the job interview slip through his fingers now? What neither Darius nor Officer Hayes realized was that a simple, unassuming device was about to upend the power dynamic and reveal more than they ever imagined. Unknown to the officer, when Darius had been forced into the squad car, one of the people on the street, a curious bystander named Mateo Torres, had captured the entire event on a hidden camera attached to his backpack. This was no ordinary smartphone footage. Mateo was a photography student at Columbia College, Chicago, fascinated by documentary filmmaking. He'd attached a small, motion-activated camera to his bag that recorded not just video, but also crisp audio. In real time, it had captured the officer's arrival, the questionable arrest, and even some of the conversation as Darius was shoved into the vehicle. Mateo had taken such precautions because he had grown tired of reading about injustices that too often slipped through the cracks. He carried the camera, hoping to film everyday life on Chicago's streets, but also prepared to record potential injustices. When he witnessed Darius's detention, his heart pounded, but he didn't want to interfere directly. Instead, he stayed in the background and let the camera do the work. He had no idea how pivotal that footage would become. Back at the police station, tensions continued to mount. Hours passed, and Darius sat alone, uncertain whether anyone was investigating his side of the story. He assumed they'd call in an eyewitness, or at least contact the diner staff to confirm his alibi. But the station seemed busy with other matters, and no one came to check on him beyond an occasional dismissive glance. Meanwhile, Officer Hayes's own day was taking unexpected turns. The manager at the vandalized business had described a perpetrator who wore a green hoodie, not a grey jacket, and had scars on his left forearm, nothing like Darius, who had no such scars. This conflicting information was given to Hayes, but he brushed it aside. He was fixated on Darius, convinced that the young man was lying about his innocence. "They change their stories all the time," he muttered to a colleague, ignoring the co-worker's raised eyebrow. Word of Darius's predicament spread quickly in the neighborhood. It reached the Regal Diner, where several employees felt outraged. The diner's manager, a warm-hearted middle-aged woman named Bridget O'Neill, had known Darius for years. She and her staff organized themselves, collecting receipts and CCTV footage from the diner to prove that Darius had indeed been there during the time of the alleged crime. One of the line cooks, Elijah, remembered exchanging a joke with Darius just as he was leaving. They gathered everything: photos, timestamps, statements, and decided to bring them to the precinct. That same afternoon, Miss Janine, the neighborhood resident who had protested during the arrest, started a small rally outside the station. She was accompanied by a group of local activists and neighbors. Placards with messages like "Justice for Darius" and "Stop Racial Profiling" sprouted among the crowd. The group chanted in unison, demanding that the police take immediate steps to verify Darius's story. Still, inside the station, no one seemed to be making progress. Finally, Bridget from the diner arrived with the CCTV footage and a typed timeline. She approached the front desk officer, who frowned disapprovingly. "We'll pass this along to the investigating officer," the desk attendant said with a dismissive shrug, giving Bridget a slip of paper. "If you want to file a formal complaint, fill this out." Frustration boiled over. Bridget insisted on speaking to someone in authority. Her persistence eventually led her to a lieutenant who was more sympathetic. He promised to look into it and let her know what happened, but the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, and Hayes managed to avoid direct confrontation. He was still telling colleagues that the suspect might be part of a bigger operation. To him, letting go of Darius too soon was akin to showing weakness. The officer believed that bridging the gap between suspicion and evidence was a matter of putting pressure on the suspect. And so, Darius continued to wait. Late that evening, while the rally outside the precinct had dwindled, a determined Mateo approached Miss Janine. With quiet resolve, he told her, "I have footage, really clear footage of what happened. It shows how the officer approached Darius, what he said, how Darius cooperated, and some of the bystanders protesting." Miss Janine's eyes lit up with both hope and caution. Together, they decided the footage needed to go public if the police continued to drag their feet. Mateo raced home to review and edit the footage. His small bedroom was cluttered with camera gear and half-finished editing projects. He loaded the hidden camera's memory card onto his laptop, his heart pounding at the potential significance of what he'd recorded. Sure enough, the footage was crystal clear. You could hear Officer Hayes shouting at Darius, making contradictory statements about the alleged crime. You could see Darius's confusion and calm compliance. You could see the mismatch between the color of the clothing described in the alleged crime and Darius's actual outfit. The clarity was haunting. An hour later, a trembling Mateo uploaded the video to YouTube with a careful description of the incident. He included disclaimers that this was raw footage, uncut except for redacting personal addresses or sensitive data that might compromise bystanders' privacy. "I have to do this," he muttered under his breath. He knew the decision came with risks, particularly from those who viewed such recordings as anti-police or sensational. But something stronger, an ingrained sense of justice, propelled him to click publish. The video spread quickly. Chicago residents shared it on social media platforms, demanding an explanation from the police. Local news outlets caught wind of the viral footage, airing short clips during their broadcasts. Suddenly, the entire city, and soon other cities around the country, was talking about the wrongful arrest on 63rd. Hashtags calling for Darius's release trended regionally. People who had never met him rallied in support. Calls and emails flooded the police department's public relations office, with outraged citizens questioning the officer's behavior. Even inside the precinct, murmurs circulated among officers who had watched the leaked footage. Some were sympathetic to Darius and had concerns about Officer Hayes' conduct. Others felt defensive, convinced the video might be out of context. As tension mounted, the precinct's leadership found themselves thrust into the spotlight. The watch commander, a gruff but fair-minded veteran named Captain Dylan Reeves, demanded an internal review. He knew that if the department failed to act swiftly, public trust, already fragile, would crater. This external pressure finally forced movement on Darius's case. Near midnight, an exasperated Officer Hayes was forced to release Darius on the grounds that there was insufficient evidence to hold him. Darius staggered out of the station, exhausted but relieved. Miss Janine, Matteo, Bridget, and a few other supporters who had waited for him enveloped him in a spontaneous cheer. The weight of the ordeal washed over him like a tidal wave of relief, but fear and anger still simmered in his gut. He walked away from the station with tears in his eyes, uncertain how to process the conflicting emotions. Yet, the story was far from over. A formal investigation had now begun. Local news channels interviewed Darius, who spoke calmly but passionately about the emotional toll of being wrongfully arrested. He thanked everyone who had supported him, especially Matteo for the critical footage. In a measured tone, he expressed his hope that the police department would take steps to ensure that no other innocent person faced a similar injustice. Meanwhile, Officer Hayes found himself under scrutiny. The station's internal affairs division, a name that often made officers uneasy, had launched an investigation led by a methodical, detail-oriented detective named Karen Watson. Detective Watson, known for her no-nonsense approach, insisted on interviewing everyone involved, the diner staff, the eyewitnesses, and especially the person who had filed the original vandalism complaint. She also reviewed the hidden camera footage in painstaking detail. The more she examined it, the harder it became to justify Hayes's actions. During his interview with Internal Affairs, Hayes tried to stick to his story. He insisted that he had probable cause and that Darius matched the description of the suspect. Detective Watson, calm but firm, pointed out the inconsistencies. The suspect was described wearing a green hoodie, not a grey jacket, she stated, referencing the complaint file. Also, you can hear yourself saying in the footage that you had no time to investigate further. Why didn't you at least question him in a more controlled manner before making the arrest? Hayes bristled. He was about to run, he lied. I could see it in his eyes. I was trying to protect the public. Detective Watson arched an eyebrow. The footage shows otherwise. Officer Hayes. He was standing calmly, hands visible at all times. The crowd even vouched for him. You chose to ignore them. Uncomfortable silence hung in the room. Hayes fidgeted, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. By now, news outlets were calling his home, seeking interviews. Anonymous threats appeared on his social media pages. Fellow officers either distanced themselves or privately condemned him. Hayes began to feel the gravity of his actions closing in like a vice around his career. A week later, an official statement from the department announced that Officer Hayes had been put on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. While the statement was couched in neutral language, it was a clear indication of the department's stance. Many felt that it was a long overdue step toward accountability. Darius, meanwhile, was trying to resume normal life, if there could be such a thing after this ordeal. He attended his job interview, though he carried the emotional scars of the arrest with him. To his relief, the hiring manager was sympathetic after seeing the incident on local news. The manager praised Darius's composure under pressure and admired his strength of character. Darius had a second interview lined up, and for the first time in days, he felt a spark of genuine optimism. Yet, as the city buzzed with talk of the incident, twists continued to unfold. One evening, Darius arrived home to find an envelope slid under his door. Inside was a note, "They're blaming you for stirring up trouble. You might want to watch your back." It was unsigned, written on a piece of scrap paper. Paranoia flickered. Could it be from a disgruntled acquaintance of Hayes? A random troublemaker? Darius's thoughts spiraled. His dreams that night were plagued by images of confrontation and betrayal. Across town, Hayes experienced his own brand of fallout. Separated from his daily routines at the station, he languished at home, pacing restlessly through his small apartment. The phone rang less and less. Former comrades were now too busy. Hayes found himself alone with nothing but regret and a creeping sense of shame. At first, he tried to cling to anger, telling himself he was the victim of sensationalism. But with each passing day, he felt a gnawing realization he had crossed a line. He had let his prejudices overshadow his duty. And now, the world was pushing back. A pivotal moment came when Hayes's own daughter, a college sophomore at the University of Illinois at Chicago, confronted him during a strained dinner. She admitted she'd seen the footage. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "that was really bad. You arrested an innocent man just because he looked like the A-type." How could you?" Her eyes brimmed with disappointment. Hayes tried to defend himself, but words failed. His daughter left the dinner table in tears. That scene haunted him. Meanwhile, a glimmer of hope for redemption appeared in the most unexpected of ways. The real vandal, the one who had smashed the car window, was apprehended during an attempted burglary. It turned out he was part of a small-time gang operating near the area where Darius had been arrested. The suspect bore no resemblance to Darius beyond being male and of a similar height. When Detective Watson connected the dots, it further dismantled any last shred of doubt regarding Darius's innocence. As the investigation closed in, the department faced overwhelming public pressure, not just to discipline Hayes, but to implement broader reforms. Civic leaders, pastors, and community organizations demanded mandated racial bias training, better oversight, and more transparency in the handling of complaints. Some of these calls fell on receptive ears. Others met with stiff resistance from older systems that were slow to adapt. For Darius, the surge of support from activists, neighbors, and strangers provided an odd solace. He was still wounded from the humiliation and fear he'd endured. Nightmares lingered, but he found community members rallying behind him with warmth and solidarity. Miss Janine began inviting him to speak at local workshops. Bridget from the diner offered him free coffee anytime he walked in. Mateo's footage, which had been the catalyst for exposing the truth, soared in view counts, garnering national attention. It was at one such community meeting, held at Street Sabina Church, an actual and well-known parish on the south side of Chicago, that a new chapter of healing began. Darius was invited to share his story in front of a modest crowd gathered in the basement hall. Rows of plastic chairs were filled with attentive faces, old and young, from different backgrounds. At the front, a microphone stood on a simple platform. Hands trembling, Darius approached the mic, scanning the crowd. He saw empathy in their eyes, and it emboldened him. He spoke of the terror he felt, the sense of violation. He shared his personal frustrations about how, even now, part of him couldn't shake the dread that something like this could happen again. Finally, he thanked everyone, particularly those who used their voices and technology to seek justice. The applause that followed thundered in the small space. Still in the throes of legal proceedings, Officer Hayes was a man living with the aftermath of his own errors. Some believed he deserved no compassion. Others argued for due process and the possibility of reforming the system. As his hearing date with Internal Affairs approached, Hayes reached out to Darius through a mutual acquaintance, a community liaison officer who had a foot in both worlds. At first, Darius hesitated, uncertain whether he wanted to hear from the man who humiliated him. But in a moment of introspection, he decided that hearing Hayes out might bring some closure. They met in a neutral setting, an almost empty coffee shop near the precinct. Darius arrived first, sitting at a back table, swirling a cup of coffee he barely touched. Hayes entered looking visibly older, shoulders slumped beneath a worn jacket. He approached timidly, his eyes never fully meeting Darius's. They sat across from each other in tense silence. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than normal. When Hayes finally spoke, his voice was low, burdened by regret. I'm sorry," he began. "I can't undo what I did to you. I got it wrong. I was so focused on being right and in control that I didn't stop to see you as a person." His hands were clenched, as if bracing for an impact he knew he deserved. Darius took a moment to let the apology settle. He remembered the humiliation, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He could have unleashed his anger, but instead he said, "I appreciate the words, but it's not just about me. It's about how often this happens, and no one believes us until there's undeniable proof. It can't keep happening." Hayes nodded, tears quietly pooling in his eyes. "I know," he whispered. "I never thought I'd be the bad guy in a story like this." Neither man offered an easy solution, but in that emotional exchange, a measure of honesty emerged. For Darius, it didn't erase the trauma, but it offered a rare glimpse of remorse from someone on the other side. In the weeks that followed, Hayes faced a formal hearing. Internal Affairs recommended a range of disciplinary measures, and the department decided to terminate his employment. The official statement cited multiple procedural violations and a pattern of unsubstantiated stops. It was a harsh blow for Hayes, who suddenly faced the world with no shield of authority. Some argued he'd gotten his karma, losing a career that he'd invested decades into. Others felt it was too little, too late. But for Darius, the final twist was a quiet victory. The logistics company offered him the job, praising his resilience. With a newfound sense of purpose, Darius resolved to use his painful experience to advocate for fairness in law enforcement. He joined a local community group that worked with the police to improve policies and training. He shared his story in forums, not to demonize every officer, but to push for a culture of accountability and respect. A year later, on a warm, late summer afternoon, Darius walked down West 63rd Street again. The memory of that fateful day still lingered, but now he felt a certain lightness in his step. He had started to channel the adversity into constructive community efforts. As he passed the diner, he waved to Bridget, who smiled and held up a coffee cup in salute. Down the block, he recognized Miss Janine tending to her small garden, a bright array of flowers that stood as a symbol of hope amid the concrete. He paused for a moment, reflecting on the journey. Unjust arrest, public outcry, the hidden camera that changed everything, the internal investigation, the apology, the new job, the activism, and the slow but steady path toward healing. Life, it seemed, could veer into darkness in an instant, but it could also pivot back toward the light when good people took action. In that moment, Darius whispered a small prayer of gratitude for all the souls who insisted on the truth. And in the distance, the city carried on, a million stories unfolding, some tragic, some hopeful, and all teetering on the delicate balance between justice and injustice. Darius couldn't control them all, but he could do his part, and that would be enough. And so ends this remarkable journey of truth, triumphing over injustice. Darius's ordeal is a stark reminder that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it can spark life-changing transformations. From the quiet resolve of a hidden camera to the collective power of community support, each person's actions helped bend the arc toward justice. Darius found a new path, demonstrating that even in the face of adversity, hope can flourish and drive real change. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone who needs to see that perseverance and unity can make a difference. Help spread awareness by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to our channel. Together, we can uplift more stories, challenge injustice, and become the catalysts for much-needed hope and healing. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice matters.